Hi, welcome back. I have another video for you, and this one here is another update for Warhammer the Old World. It does appear that we're going to get weekly videos, just sort of like I assumed last week. It seems to be Games Workshop's go-to style now. When something new is coming, they did this for 40k, and I believe also for Horus Heresy. You get a lot of continual weekly updates, and this is basically to hype you up and make you want to buy this new product while they prep the last little bits to get it ready. And I think they're doing a great job so far because this is another really good, solid article, helping us understand what the game is all about. So the movement phase. Um, just to recap, though, actually, I should go over that. Last time we had the command phase. That was explaining how basically you set up your turn. It's where you do your rallying. It's where you do some of your spells. It's where you do basically anything that's not normal turn mechanics. It happens in the command phase. But the movement phase that we're moving into today, this is the most important phase in the game. Anybody who's played Warhammer Fantasy is likely going to agree with me, I think, that if you move your army well, um, you are basically able to force your opponent to play reactively to you. They don't get to do their own stuff as much. Yes, there are things that can be done like magic and shooting that will, allow for some leeway or basically some like swing turns. But usually, if you can get good movements, if you can get good positioning, your opponent, they're going to have to actually just deal with that. So I move my knights forward and wheel them in a certain way. Now my opponent might need to reform their unit to make sure they're facing the right way, or I move up a smaller unit at an angle that could force them to basically have no choice but to charge because you can't move through enemy units in most games. Um, but because of the angle, once they charge, you can react and flee and make them chase you, which then leads to them being out of position, and they know that's going to happen, so they might just sit there while they try to figure out how to deal with this. And again, you're just basically forcing them to play your game, and they have to deal with that before they can start playing their turns normally. So it's a very important phase. And now that I've gone over kind of like that preamble rant, I'm going to get right into it. So the first thing they talk about is formations. Formations are very important. Unlike Age of Sigmar, unlike 40k, unlike Horus Heresy, Lord of the Rings, basically unlike any of their round-based skirmish games, our units are not only groups of models that form up together, they have to form up in formations. In Warhammer Fantasy, that most normally is going to require you to form a brick or a block of troops. Here they're calling them the close order, close order and open order. And as you can see, you have a group of Bretonnians, and they are 5 wide and 3 deep. That's 15 guys that are touching base to base. They can be done in different ways, as we're going to see, but your basic troopers have to be base to base, and most beneficially in this style. There's other ways to do it, but this is the one that's going to get you the most attacking models, but also ranks. Ranks are how you get bonuses to leadership. At least that's how it used to work. I'm going to assume they've kept that. Specifically, sorry, not bonuses to leadership, bonuses to combat resolution. Combat resolution just being it's a very much an older GW style of gameplay mechanic, and some other games still use it. But basically, in the past, when you had combat, whether it was 40k or fantasy, there would basically be a count up at the end of how many wounds were caused and different factors that could raise or lower the victory number per side, and then the difference of how many points one unit got versus the other would lead to a negative modifier for the losing team or losing unit when they did a morale check. Mildly complicated, but once you've done it 2 or 3 times, if you're a board gamer, you know what I mean. Once you've done a turn order a couple of times, you get it. It's the same thing here. It's really not that complicated once you've tried it, but it does sound very, very complex to somebody who's new to this, especially if you're coming over from Total War. I definitely can understand where some of this is going to be confusing, which is why I'm trying to be very thorough in my explanations. So, anyways, most units will form up this way, whether they're infantry or cavalry or monstrous infantry or whatever. Uh, Ignore this for now. That is cavalry. I get that, but just ignore that. We'll get to that in a second. Um, Everything uses this. And this is just sort of what you're going to see outside of a few units. One example being skirmishers. Skirmishers are units of light infantry in most cases, and they have a special formation where they don't have to touch base to base. This allows you to string them out to basically deny charges into your units, or it forces the enemy like I've said before, to charge you at weird angles, or you can use this to basically squeeze them through tiny spaces. Also, usually they're harder to shoot at. Um, think of it this way: if you're going to fire a volley of arrows into an enemy army, the closer they are together, like the closed order or open order that they show here, um, the more likely your arrows are going to hit. Skirmishers are the opposite because they're spread out. The arrows have a harder time hitting. Again, a lot of what I'm saying here, I cannot tell you for sure this is how the game will play, but I'm going to tell you right now everything I've read so far, other than minor tweaks or something, very different, like how magic is going to work now. But most of it is very much exactly how the game used to play, based in these two articles I've read so far. So I think that we can safely assume there will be modifiers to shooting that are basically like to do with how far away or the type of unit you're shooting at. And in this case here, this is very much likely meaning -1 to hit these guys in shooting. That's a pretty powerful bonus. Again, these are light troops. They're not tough. But by getting them a negative modifier for enemy to shoot at them, it keeps them alive a little bit longer. And then we have an example here of a special formation. There's probably going to be more of them, but this is the Lance formation. Now, this is unique to Bretonia. Bretonia had the Lance formation since at least 5th edition. I might have had it in 4th edition, but from 6th edition to 8th edition, it was not in this shape. It was 3 wide and up to 5 deep. Usually it was like 5 minimum knights. So it was 3 and then 2 with a gap in the middle. So it was a very strange formation. It was sort of like a U. And that middle space was saved for damsels or, further knights if you were expanding the unit. They had a very strange formation. In 5th edition, they formed like this. It was much more like an actual lance. Again, if you're a Total War player, you will recognize this as a kind of a wedge formation. This is very common in cavalry combat throughout history, with the goal of basically, like all wedges, to force something open. Cavalry in a wedge can get inside of an enemy infantry unit and basically divide them, which makes them easier to destroy in combat because now they're not a cohesive unit. What this related to, or how this worked in the game, it's not as complex as that. So like, don't worry that that's going to be some sort of crazy, over the top rule set where you're really like almost like simulating a real battle. All this meant was that most combats involved groups of infantry facing off each other or groups of cavalry or whatever, and you would have either 1, 2, or sometimes more ranks of men that were able to just fight forward. And if they weren't touching, they couldn't fight. And if they were too far back in the ranks, based on the type of unit and the addition and the rules that went with it, you would have so in 6th edition, I'm going to just give you an example. In 6th edition, you had 1 rank that could fight unless you had spears, and in which case spears could fight in an extra rank if they were not the attacker. In what was it, 8th edition, I think it was, they added fight in 2 ranks. It might have been 7th, but I think it was 8th edition, fight in 2 ranks. That meant the front rank could fight, and the second rank could also join that fight, but the third could not unless you were in a horde, which is a whole nother thing, but don't worry about that because we're really hoping those aren't here. Oh, sorry about that. The lance formation for Bretonia was very, very different. Basically, as a lance, the goal was to let you have most of your knights fighting because Bretonians relied on knights, um, and they had to actually win combat as soon as possible, or they would get trapped, and their depth would allow you to get flanked very easily and wiped out. So they would have as many attacks as you had ranks going down the sides. So basically, you would have one, two, three guys, or I guess like this. You would have three guys like this, and it would go all the way down in this big giant rectangle, and all of these guys would fight, and then all of the knights going down this way, all the knights going down this way. So on the two sides, they would all fight, plus the one here. So let's say you had 15 knights, five rows of three, sorry, five ranks of three. You would have five plus another four plus another four plus one. So you would have quite a few of your knights hitting. To get 10 knights hitting in, say, the Empire, you would have to have 5 knights by 2 knights. Um, it was, and that was a very wide unit because knights are on slightly wider bases, meaning you'd have units of knights that would be very, very wide, and that would allow them to have a harder time moving. The lance formation also allows Bretonian knights to move very easily around the battlefield compared to most cavalry units, and that's a big benefit because again, movement wins games. So if you can get to places that other knights can't, or that people don't expect your knights to be able to get to, you can dictate how the game is going to go. It's a very powerful formation. I know I've talked about this a lot. I'm going to start moving on, but I felt it was very important to cover why this is awesome. Not only to see the classic lance back, even before I started playing fantasy, this is the lance formation I remember. By the time I joined the game, that was going out of style, and the new 6th edition book was coming, which replaced it with, again, the party bus, 3 wide, 5 deep formations I mentioned. Now, moving down, they explain combat order and marching order. That's because in Warhammer Fantasy, combat order is just the simple formation I already mentioned that's like, 5 wide or whatever, and you would have more guys across than you do going down. So as they write here, i.e. it has more models per rank than it has per file. So if you ever see in their writing, they talk about rank and file. Rank is simply men going across left to right, whereas file are front to back. You are going to have more going across the front than you are going back towards the rear. That's all combat order is. Marching order, on the other hand, is less wide than it is deep. This is, in this case here, 4 wide and 5 deep. So while this one here is 5 units or 5 models wide, this one's only 4. What this does is it puts you into marching column. This is new, or at least new to me. Maybe this existed in like 5th or earlier, but when I started in 6th edition, this is not how marching worked. Marching simply meant you would be able to move double. So if you had a 4-inch movement, that's the kind of the standard human movement that most things are based on. If you had 4-inch movement, you could move 8 inches on a march. You could not fight a combat at the end of a march. You usually could not shoot. Again, there might be a special rule. There's often special rules that negate things in these Warhammer games. But more often than not, this is comparable to 40k, where you would run. I forget. I think advance rolls. I forget what they call it in 10th edition. But basically, you roll a die and add it to your movement. This one here was just doubling. In Warhammer, the Old World, you didn't, or sorry, and in Warhammer Fantasy, you did not have to change formation. In Warhammer Fantasy, the Old World, it does appear you need to change formation. You go into the marching column, and for those who are history buffs, you know what a marching column is. That's like when you see like a Civil War, American Civil War movie. That's those like little like long strings of men marching up the road. That's a marching column. So basically, you make this new formation by losing front uh, rank length and adding it to your depth, and then you can move at triple speed. That's crazy to me. Triple speed. So for example, again, a human is 4 movement. And a table, the old game, was 48 inches across. So a human unit walking would take 12 turns to walk from, one side to the other. A little bit less because obviously ranks, the back rank touching the board edge is going to, take up some space. But let's just call it 11 turns to walk from one side to the other or something like that, 10 or 11 turns. Um, they would cut that in half when they marched because they're doubling. There was different ways to get bonuses, like say a magic standard for +1 movement. Different things that added up. But triple, that is taking it from like, you know, a march, 5 or 6 marches, depending on how far they're going, down to 4 marches or less, maybe 3. Again, because they're going to be deep. So this thing's going to be, pushing up very far. That's a massive movement advantage. Again, movement is king in this game. If you can get your guys into position quickly, that gives you more time to get them back into formation. There is a thing mentioned here in the movement phase. We'll get to it, but basically there is an option to change your formation again. This is going to be a big deal. Now, especially too, if you can go from this formation to this formation in a single turn. If it's an option to basically reform into a march and do the march that turn, basically they start marching and change the formation as they're walking. That's going to be crazy. But even if it's just allowing you to start with some units in a marching column who can then quickly get into position, whether that's towards the center or up flanks to get to the rear, that's going to be a very powerful choice. It might not always be for the best, as we'll see. So like there's things about this that is going to be negative. You are deeper, meaning you're easier to charge in the flank. It's they're going to have more exposed flank. But being able to get your guys into position, again, it just dictates how the enemy has to react to you. Humans, again, have 4-inch march, like I told you, or 4-inch movement. And then you had units like Skaven and Elves. They move 5. Ogres, their base movement was 6. I know they're a legendary army, but they are in the game under Legends. They might not show up at tournaments, but people are going to play Ogres. If you have a column of Ogres moving 18 inches, you are basically like, what is that, like a third of the way across the board. Plus, I mean, they're ogres, so they're huge and they have big depth. Like, it's going to be like 2 turns and they'll essentially be on the other side of the board. That's a big deal, and it's just something to keep in mind. That's a very cool new addition to this game. This is one of the newest things. Now, movement phase, we're getting right into it. Now, that was all the basic like examples of what you need to know to understand movement. But now we get into what the movement phase is. So first off, movement phase in fantasy always begins with the charge. Now in 40k, you move, you shoot, you do whatever. And at the very end, you declare charges, and then you fight those you move and fight the combats in those charges. In Warhammer Fantasy, because charging is powerful, it's getting good soldiers, or maybe bad ones, but there's a benefit to getting into combat where either you might get to strike first, or you just dictate again how who gets the combat bonuses, because there are sometimes charge bonuses that are involved. By being the person getting into combat, you get to once again choose how the game is played. So anyways, back on task. You declare charges, and at that point, once you've declared all your charges in fantasy, you measure out the distances, and then you check to see if you can make it. Before you do anything, though, the enemy has to choose between holding, stand and shoot, or flee. These are called charge reactions. Any unit that's being charged has to make a reaction. Holding just means they stand and take it. Stand and shoot means they have some sort of weapon that they can shoot with. Not all weapons can be shot in this way. Some are too unwieldy, and others can always be shot in that way because occasionally you're too close to the enemy so that when they start charging, your men essentially don't have time to prepare their weapons. But if they have something lighter, like say slings maybe, or Clan Eshin Skaven have like ninja stars, throwing stars, they can always stand and shoot. And there's other examples, but those are the 2 main ones, except for flee, which is simply, I cannot take this charge, I need to get out of here, and your guys run away. So as we can see, flee is here, um, and it just means that you can essentially say, I don't want to have this fight. You roll some dice usually, and that's how far you can leave. I think it's going to be slightly different based on what we're about to see, but essentially I think it's going to work the same. They do have something else here. Um, Beyond that, some especially alert units may countercharge. Countercharge to me, um, in Warhammer Fantasy, is the Empire detachment rule. You're going to hear about that when I do my next video. It should be posted, I think, tomorrow, or the day after this, anyways, because I still have to record it, but I have finished creating everything I need. I just need to record the video. But basically, the Empire have a type of unit um, that supports your main blocks of troops by either standing and shooting to help them, or by countercharging when those units are being, when the main unit is charged, the smaller units can charge in and help. So that's what I think they're talking about, but I can't be sure. Maybe they're going to change up how that works, and it's going to become more of a universal rule. I just think that because they're saying some especially alert units, it's obviously not going to be a standard reaction. Only some units will get this. I don't mind if this goes to other units. It does feel like an Empire rule to me, but it also doesn't feel like it's that big of a deal if some units can countercharge, meaning they just get some sort of bonus, um, as if they also charged. I think dwarves may have had something like that at one time. Um, then the second step here they show is to make your charge moves. So again, you're going to say, I'm going to charge this unit, Unit A, into your Unit B. To do that, you take your base movement. So let's again go back to humans, 4. And then you're going to roll a die. I guess they actually give an example here of skeletons. They also have a movement of 4. So it's 4 plus 1d6. And you just roll a d6 and add that. So here, let's read this. To establish the range of their charge, units roll 2 dice. Pick the highest score from the 2 and add it to their movement characteristics. So you roll 2 dice, but you don't get 2. So it's not like 2d6, which is like 2 to 12, plus 4, which is what it was in 8th edition. 8th edition had crazy long charges happening. This is only 1 die. It's random, meaning you could have some sort of kind of fluffy storytelling moment of like the unit thinks it's in range, it's not far, and they roll a 1 and they just don't make it. The ground was muddy or slippery, so they didn't get very far. And you wind up between 5 and 10 inches for those skeletons. It'd be the same for humans. And then they also mentioned Bretonnian knights here. They're more dangerous. That's because Bretonnian knights are horses, or they're cavalry on horses. They have swift stride. This is another rule that's just making its way over. Cavalry get an extra d6, and they pick from the highest. Now, in this case here, I do wonder if they'll get to choose 2 of the 3d6 to represent a higher range, but I don't think so, because again, that puts us in the position where you have wildly far charges. I think just having 3d6, where I think on 3d6 the average roll is like 11, and 11 with 3 numbers is you're going to get a decent roll, is essentially what I'm saying, on average. You could roll 3 1s, but you could also roll 3 6s, basically. And Bretonnian Knights had an 8-inch movement. If you had 8 plus 6, that's 14 inches. That's still a very far charge. Again, we're talking like you're getting over a quarter of the way across the board in one movement, and you're going into combat with that. So that's the benefit of cavalry. It's very quick movement, both on the during the movement phase in general, but during combat charges as well. And then they do mention wheeling, another staple of fantasy. That just means as the unit moves, they can turn a little bit. And because you're in brick formations, they don't just kind of like turn like 40k guys can just like make a 90-degree turn as you're going. Like guys can run around a corner and it's nothing. In fantasy, because all these guys have to stay in their ranked formations, You need to basically slowly turn it like you're opening or closing a door. And as you make those little pivoting turns, you need to account for the movement. So let's say I make a charge, but I need to make two movements. So let's say like he's going this way, and then I want to, if you follow the mouse here, sorry, I'm trying to make this visible. Um, they're going straight, but then I want them to go this way. I need to basically start turning them here and measuring that turn. Usually it's just basically how far the furthest model went. So like if he went from here to here, I measure that's 1 inch. That just means that move, that wheel was 1 inch. So if I had a 12-inch charge, I go up 6. I lose one more for 7 to get my wheel, and then I have 5 left to go straight, and hopefully I get into combat. If you don't make your charge for whatever reason, it's called whiffing the rolls, what they're calling it here, but essentially, basically, if you roll bad, your guys are going to move their maximum distance, and they are going to stop wherever they get to. In the past, because we rolled 2 dice, you would roll 2, and if you failed, you would just pick the lowest, or sorry, the highest, and you would move forward that much. Now you just go the entire way. So like if it's a 14-inch charge, you're going for like make it or break it. I need the maximum charge on these Bretonians. You roll 13. You do not get there. Basically what happens is you move 1 inch away from the enemy, and your horses are sitting there. They are in big trouble because horses, cavalry, they're best on the charge. Their armor is good, but you don't want to have a Bretonian knight unit just sitting there ready to get eaten when they get charged. And then they have compulsory moves. Now, compulsory just means you have to do it. These are anything that's random. So they mentioned Night Goblin Fanatics. These are, well, it's this guy right here. It's a goblin with a big ball and chain spinning around trying to kill people by running into them. He just sort of randomly moves. That I also love that just reading random movement. That means we get scatter die, just like Warhorse Heresy. Scatter die, for those who don't know, is simply a d6 where it has 2 targets. Let's just call it the 1 and the 6. And then the other 4 faces are arrows. Whichever way, when the dice stops, the arrows are pointing, that's the direction you go. And if it's a hit, then you don't change direction unless it has to move in a random direction, in which case the hit bullseye is going to have a built-in little arrow. Again, it's one of those things that sounds very complicated. I apologize, but it's not. It does lead to arguments. I will say this. Random movement is a great mechanic for fun games. Random movement is a bad mechanic if you're playing competitively or with, I'll be blunt, an asshole. People will bump the table to make that thing move a certain way just to shimmy it because, hey, I'm facing the wrong way with this, but if I kind of bump the table, bump, it might shift a little and let me, change the direction. Or they'll roll the dice really far away, and then they'll, measure out 6 inches going, 85 degrees because that's the direction the arrow's pointing. And then they'll drag that whole measuring tape 3 feet. They'll measure far away on purpose. And they'll drag it across, and as the measuring tape is moving, it's twisting, and it looks like an accident because honestly, take a measuring tape and try to pull it a foot or two without changing the angle at all. And again, movement is important. That angle matters. You might be a couple of degrees off. It's not a big deal. But if this thing twists, and I've watched people twist it, and you're watching them, and they're just saying it's not happening. I get it. Random movement. This is the contention right here. This is where you will find arguments. It's really unfortunate because it is an excellent and fun mechanic, but people are going to abuse this or are just not going to listen about simple things like roll the scatter die next to the unit, as in like roll it towards them so it like kind of bumps them and stops, because you want that as close as possible. That's important. Yeah, this is the only thing so far that, as much as it makes me happy, it makes me apprehensive. I do get concerned about that. Back on topic. The last one they mentioned is stupidity. That's simply a special rule where you roll a leadership check. If you pass, your unit can do whatever. It's a normal unit. If they fail, they're stupid. They just stand there, or they shuffle forward 2 inches, 3 inches. Um, this is another fun mechanic, and a lot of people are going to love it. A lot of people are going to hate it. This is where Warhammer Fantasy gets a little hard um, for people who aren't into a lot of rules to kind of like deal with, because there's a lot of little things like this which are very flavorful. If you go into this game with the mindset that you're having fun and crazy stuff is going to happen, and it won't always be like, it won't feel fair, but it is fun. So that's something to really consider as you're getting into the idea of Warhammer Fantasy. Um, that there will be moments where somebody might make the game feel worse for you because they're playing it poorly. And I don't mean like they're, not playing 40k well, which is already can be a problem. But like again, those whole random movements, or your units just won't do what you want, and that's a fairly rare mechanic to see in games. But again, it's very flavorful. It's a good mechanic. It's also one you just often, most people just avoid it because they're going to get frustrated with the idea of a stupid unit like trolls, who are like supposed to get in there and just like break face, and I don't know, they just stop and pick their nose and scratch their ass, and you're just kind of like, no, but guys, like you're like 3 inches away. This was really important, and you're trying to figure out how to re-roll that die. So just something to keep in mind. Then they have remaining moves. Remaining moves is simply just any movement that is not charges. And so you have declare charges, charge moves, compulsory moves, and remaining moves. I got lost for a second, sorry. Basically, any moves that are not the other ones is really all it comes down to. The unit is not charging, the unit isn't like reacting in any way, so they don't have to flee maybe. They're not like forced to move because again, they're stupid, or they have random movement, or they're this is also where you might have something to do with what's it called? Frenzy, another special rule where basically they want to get into combat, and if they're not in range to make a charge, they still have to move directly towards. That's a compulsory move. Remaining move is just like, I want these guys to go from point A to point B. They're not charging, they're not doing anything funky, they're just going to move from here to there. That's it. That's remaining moves. That's where most of your units will move in the early game, especially by the time you get to later game. You'll either have nothing left that's doing that because everything's just charging or stuck in combat. Um, or maybe you might have something moving, but it's like, running off to get an objective or something. Anyways, the mechanics of movement. We've already gone over the basics, I think, with pretty much more than the basics, really. I've kind of gotten in depth here because I really just like this phase. So basically, move or march. Once you're past charging, it's move or march. Will they move? In the first case, they move up to their movement characteristics. So again, humans 4, they move 4 inches. There's times where you'll say, oh, well, I should just march, but you won't be allowed to for various reasons. There could be terrain that's stopping you, whether it's because marching over that terrain is dangerous, or because enemy units are too close and your men are not willing to just march without care and concern. So basically, there's a thing called march blocking. You can get close to an enemy and limit their movement. Again, controlling their turn. So now they have to figure out how to get away from you, or they have to chase that unit away, or otherwise kill it. And this is the type of movement you do basically when you just want to shuffle up a little and do a little bit of shooting or other stuff. Marching is the one, again, where you're like going triple speed, but you're giving up a bunch of options. So we haven't talked about shooting and stuff yet, but it doesn't matter um, because that's another article. But basically, if you want to move and shoot and your weapon lets you do that, if you march, you can't do it. Because essentially your turn is used up. The chance for them to get into position and shoot has been wasted because they ran forward a lot longer than the unit that only went 4 inches. These guys went 12 inches. So basically, they went to the space that's 3 times further away instead of stopping, the first third of the leg with the way there, the first leg, and shooting their weapon, whether it was a bow or whatever. And they give an example here of a cavalry unit. This is what I'm talking about wheeling. I guess now you can see it. This is a much better example than my terrible try. They move from here, and then they move at a wheel. So this guy basically just kind of swings to here. So now they're facing this way. And then the formation moves to there. And then again, this guy swings until he's facing here in this direction, meaning he can go straight and get them to there. And then there's another wheel. This is them trying to get around this terrain. This is what I mean. Movement is very important. It's very tricky. And this is the most important phase because it does come down to, do you know how to use your army? And do you know how to move your army? It's not 40k, it's not Age of Sigmar, where movement is not that, it's important. It's not complicated though, because you don't have to worry about little extra things because everybody is just independently moving to the best of their ability. One or two guys might be in a position where they can't quite go where you want them to go, but the majority should be able to, most turns, move the way you want them to. Warhammer Fantasy is the opposite. You will often be in a position where you don't get to move the way you want to because the enemy has not given you that opportunity. You could move that way, but you become open to counterattacks, not the special rule, but I mean like them charging into you. You're trying to get to position and they attack you. Or you simply just, are not that great at the game and you need to get practice, and this is something to take into your heart and think about. You just might not do well the first few games, especially if you're playing against somebody who is more veteran. That is unfortunately something I dealt with early on, playing with people who were much better than me, that had a much better grasp of the movement phase. Anyways, they mentioned here wheeling and turning. This is another thing. After you can wheel, they also mentioned turning. I'm going to try to wrap this up. This is going on really, really long. I apologize for that. Turning is basically just moving 90 or 180 degrees. That would just mean these guys would just, turn and look this way now. They're going this way instead. That's a type of movement we could do before, or 180, meaning they start here facing forward, and then they turn around, they're facing the other way. You might have to do that because all of a sudden something's behind you. They also mentioned that you can move backwards or sideways at half pace. That just means your 4 inches becomes 2. And they can redress the ranks or reform. That's just fixing your ranks. You might wind up at times where your ranks are broken in some way. And you need to basically fix them. So you can just go, I'm going to reform, and you can just kind of move guys around as long as the center is essentially in the same place. And it's just getting a new style, a new look of formation. Anyways, that was a lot. My mouth's getting really dry from so much talking, but I'm excited about this. This is great. This is everything I was hoping to see because it's basically the same. I don't mind changes. I'm looking forward to the magic change as it stands because it sounds interesting. But movement is so important that I'm so happy to see it's staying the same. It's not changing in some weird way. It's not becoming simplified. I mean, I think this right here is probably the best example they can give us of how complicated this turn might be considered by some people. Because, they don't just go straight line to there. Once you get better, that will probably happen. But most people will do wheeling and stuff the way they're showing here with incremental movements. Yeah, no, I'm super excited. I hope everybody else who has been waiting for this is excited. And I hope anybody who's just even a little bit interested can kind of get like a little tingle of excitement. Like, this is a little bit more. This game does not hold your hand. And I like 40k. I've always loved 40k. I started with 40k. But 40k, every single edition feels a little bit more like the gameplay itself is very hand-holdy. You don't have to think about the gameplay. You're thinking more about unit interactions and things like that. It's a little bit more of a deck builder. It feels like Magic the Gathering at times, whereas the actual basic game does not feel complicated. It feels very relaxed, which is not bad. Sometimes you want a chill game. But sometimes you want to just be crouched over a table and feel like, a real general where you're watching your troops move, you're calling out orders, and you're just getting that sweet feeling of just you accomplished something because you got them to the position that you needed them to be in for next turn, and the enemy maybe didn't think you could do it, or you just sort of like called a Hail Mary on getting these guys somewhere that allowed you to swing a game. I have seen games go from being a one sided affair to just completely collapsing for the player who's winning because something got into position and got a really good charge or, a really good flank or rear charge, basically running into the sides or the rear of an enemy unit and just utterly destroying something that was winning. So, yeah, super excited. I hope everybody else is too. Thank you for listening. I know this was long. I'm going to try to not have this much of a reaction article or a reaction to the article next week on shooting. And I don't think I'll need to. It's not 40K. Shooting is not some crazy thing that needs this much explanation. This is the phase to understand. Once we have all these articles together, I'm going to do a complete rundown of how this game sounds like it's going to play. I'm going to break it down turn by turn again, and movement phase will. I'll write it out next time. It will be less, off the knee, just reaction to a really great article. It'll be actually really. I'll formulate it better, and I'll create my own imagery to help explain what I'm talking about. Anyways, I'm going to stop there because I am just ranting. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for watching, and if you have any thoughts or questions, please leave them down below. And as always, have yourselves a great day.